Welcome to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. On June 20th, 1979, during the gas shortage, President Jimmy Carter hit the roof where he just installed solar panels. Visionary. But drivers wanted something to fill their tanks. Why some of those panels are now in a Chinese museum. But first, the president's son, Hunter, agrees to a plea deal involving tax and gun charges.
If you are the president's son, you get a sweetheart deal.
The search for 5 souls in a submersible craft lost beyond the reach of sunlight.
We do not have all of the necessary expertise and equipment required in a search of this nature.
And a new report says the world's highest peaks are melting. But we begin our report with a search for a submersible missing in the northern Atlantic. 5 people were on board the vessel as it made its way to the depths of the ocean to explore the wreckage of the Titanic. Now, as officials cycle through strategies of rescue, they know success has a narrow window. The submersible left on the excursion with a 96-hour supply of oxygen on Sunday, meaning oxygen could completely run out by Thursday. CBS News correspondent Roxana Saberi has more on the search of efforts.
Search crews are frantically scouring an area larger than the state of Connecticut. But so far, there's no sign of the missing vessel, the Titan, and its 5 passengers.
What are the biggest challenges you're facing?
You're dealing with a surface search and a subsurface search, and frankly, that makes it an incredibly complex operation.
But time is dwindling fast because they're running out of oxygen.
We know at this point we're approximately about 41 hours.
There's no other trip like this.
For the past 2 years, the U.S.-based company OceanGate Expeditions has used the submersible to take tourists to the famous Titanic shipwreck, charging $250,000 per person. At nearly 2.5 miles below the ocean surface, the Titanic is located at roughly twice the depth of the Grand Canyon. Finding the Titan won't be easy at those depths, even if it's floating on the surface. Rescuers are now gaming out different scenarios in the event they find it. Among the 5 missing passengers, Hamish Harding, a British billionaire who flew into space on Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin rocket last year. Pakistani-British businessman Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Soleiman. And Paul-Henri Nargeolet, a former diver with the French Navy and a seasoned Titanic researcher. OceanGate's CEO, Stockton Rush, is also on the vessel.
We run the whole thing with this game controller.
Last year, OceanGate hosted CBS Sunday Morning correspondent David Pogue on an expedition to the Titanic. But just minutes into his dive, something went wrong.
So apparently those floats there came off the platform.
So we're scrubbing?
Yeah, I think that's the consensus up here.
The weight of the situation is bearing down on friends and family. Jannica Mikkelsen spoke with her friend Hamish Harding the day before he left.
It's not good. It really isn't good. It will be a miracle if the crew returns alive.
And Roxana Saberi joins me now. Roxana, we saw you speaking with Coast Guard officials. Who else is helping with this rescue effort?
Well, John, the effort is an international one. There are teams from Canada, France, and the U.S. involved so far. From the U.S., the Navy and the Coast Guard, as you mentioned, they're working together. And today I spoke with 2 members of New York's Air National Guard. They're helping search for the Titan on the surface of the water using technology like radar. But they've said they've already had several challenges yesterday. The weather was not good. Visibility was very poor. There was a lot of rain and fog, and though they had night goggles, they said they had no illumination to help them out at night. They were hoping for better conditions today. And also, Major Patrick Harding told me he's never searched for a submersible before. On previous missions, they've searched for things like sailboats and small fishing boats, so about the same size as the Titan, but he expects less of the submersible would appear on the surface of the water, maybe even a few inches only, so it would be a lot harder to spot. John?
And Roxana, this involves a submersible. How's that different from a submarine?
Yeah, they are unlike submarines, which leave and return under their own power. Submersibles require a ship to set them off and then to recover them. We know OceanGate had hired the Polar Prince to do just that with the Titan. The Titan was supposed to make multiple dives on each expedition, and the company has described it as, quote, the largest of any deep diving submersible. It reported that 28 people visited the Titanic wreck site last year. John?
Roxana Saberi in Boston. Thank you. And later this hour, we'll speak with a Titanic expedition leader and explorer who knows some of those on board the missing vessel. The president's son, Hunter Biden, has agreed to a federal plea deal that will likely mean he will not have to go to prison. According to a court filing made public Tuesday by the Justice Department, Biden will plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges. The agreement will also spare him prosecution on a felony charge of illegally possessing a firearm. Catherine Herridge has more from Washington.
As part of the Hunter Biden plea agreement, 3 charges were filed in a Delaware court. 2 misdemeanor counts of willful failure to pay federal income tax on annual earnings in excess of $1.5 million. A 3rd count, possession of a handgun by a drug user, would be dismissed if Biden remains drug-free and commits no additional crimes during a specified time period. A source familiar with the term said Biden's legal team expects probation, not jail time, though final approval rests with the judge.
I think the judge is going to do what's fair, and I think what's fair is, my client gets on with his life.
David Weiss, the U.S. attorney in Delaware who led the probe, was appointed by then-President Trump and left in place by the Biden administration. In a statement, Weiss said the investigation is ongoing, but Hunter Biden's team sees it differently.
My understanding is that we're done.
Traveling in California, President Biden was asked about the news.
I'm very proud of my son.
Hunter Biden spoke about the federal investigation on CBS Sunday Morning.
I'm cooperating completely, and I am absolutely certain, 100% certain, that at the end of the investigation, that I will be cleared.
While Democrats hailed the agreement as a sign of the Justice Department's independence, Republicans cried foul. Former President Donald Trump, arraigned on criminal charges last week, said Hunter Biden was given a mere traffic ticket.
You think this is another example of a 2-tier system of justice in America?
Republican Congressman James Comer leads the House Oversight Committee, which is investigating the Biden family's foreign business dealings, a probe disputed by the White House.
Will you call the U.S. attorney in Delaware to testify?
I would expect the U.S. attorney to testify in front of the House of Representatives very soon. He needs to explain whether or not his investigation is concluded.
Gene Rossi, a former Justice Department official who handled tax cases, told CBS News the failure to pay tax on more than $3 million, even though now repaid, is a serious violation.
If this were Hunter Smith instead of Hunter Biden, I think you would have a very much more aggressive prosecution.
And Catherine Herridge joins me now, along with Chief Investigative Correspondent Jim Axelrod. Catherine, I want to start with you. Hunter Biden's lawyer says this 5-year investigation has now been resolved. Has it, though?
Well, that's where the daylight is, John, between Hunter Biden's team and the U.S. attorney in Delaware, who put out a statement today saying the investigation is ongoing. We're going to learn all the details when we finally get to see this plea agreement memo. That will be filed typically on the day that Hunter Biden surrenders and the judge reviews and then signs off on the plea agreement or refuses the plea agreement. That document, all that matters is what's within the 4 corners of that document. So the parties may differ on what was agreed, but that document, which is not public, will tell the whole story.
Jim, let's talk about the IRS whistleblower that you've reported on. What was it that this was a career IRS supervisory agent? What led that agent to complain to the Inspector General and ultimately come to CBS News to raise concerns about political interference in this tax case?
Well, John, Gary Shapley, as you say, a career IRS supervisory agent, said that there had been preferential treatment given to a target of his investigation he was working on. CBS News sources told us that indeed that target was Hunter Biden. Shapley went sought some protection so that he could testify to the House Ways and Means Committee and flesh out what his charges were. What he said was preferential treatment given to who we now know was Hunter Biden. He testified for 6 hours behind closed doors last month, while sources that are familiar with the deliberations tell us that Shapley's testimony, a transcript of that testimony, and some documents that he provided will be made public as early as later this week. So we will get an inkling, some insight for the first time into what was going on over the last 5 years with the investigation into Hunter Biden, if the transcript of Shapley's testimony and the documents he provided to the committee are indeed supplied.
Catherine, I was in your piece. Gene Rossi said that basically there would have been a different result if his name had been Hunter Smith. What about, did any reporting on whether that's true on the gun charge? And at the end of the day, what's being said here? Is it that David Weiss put a thumb on the scale? Somebody at Justice put a thumb on the scale? What's exactly the allegation in terms of if he's getting different treatment?
Right. I think we need to see, going back to this memo of the plea agreement, because it's going to stipulate what exactly has been agreed to and what Hunter Biden is pleading guilty to. So in some respects, we're a little bit sort of shooting in the dark here. However, what I heard from Gene Rossi was reinforced from other former Justice Department officials who dealt with tax cases. And they said to me that once you cross a threshold of about $200,000 on unpaid income, it's still a misdemeanor, but often there's jail time. And the reason for that is they want to have an across-the-board situation that rich people aren't really allowed to skip on their tax and then later pay it and then do no time. So they want to have some equality, basically, depending on this particular charge. And then finally on the gun, a diversion program is a little unusual. You just have to search on the internet to look at DOJ.gov and unlawful or drug user gun possession, and you'll see that people are routinely given jail sentences in federal prisons for not exactly the same, but similar scenarios. So I think it's ultimately both elements of the plea that have become controversial.
Mm-hmm. And so, Jim, if this deal, the plea deal, is predicated on the belief that this would end the investigation, how will the Hunter Biden camp assess the U.S. Attorney's statement that said it was still ongoing?
Well, you heard in Catherine's piece that the feeling is it's over. I can tell you from my discussions with sources inside the Hunter Biden camp that there is 100% understanding that this is the end of the investigation. But, John, I think the point is worth making, that hanging over the entire analysis of what has happened is that you have a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware who has been overseeing this investigation. And he said as recently as June 7th, David Weiss wrote, "Throughout my tenure as U.S. attorney, my decisions have been made, and with respect to the Hunter Biden matter, must be made without reference to political consideration." So there's still this explanation. What would a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, what would his motivation be, or what would his reasoning be for going light on Hunter Biden?
We got some more documents to look at that will help us clear up this story, but thank you for helping us get this far. Catherine Herridge and Jim Axelrod. Appreciate it. A tentative start date of August 14th has been set for Donald Trump's federal criminal trial over his handling of classified documents. Monday night, he gave his defense of why he didn't answer a subpoena and made representations that he had.
Why not just hand them over then? Because I had boxes. I want to go through the boxes and get all my personal things out. I don't want to hand that over to NARA yet. And I was very busy, as you've sort of seen.
Judge Eileen Cannon set the date for 8 weeks after Trump's arraignment, a timeline typical of her cases since being appointed as a federal judge by then-President Trump in 2020. The trial is almost certain to be pushed back, however, in addition to complications of turning over and sharing sensitive evidence. Trump's legal team is expected to file a number of pre-trial motions to delay or even dismiss the case entirely. A former Trump attorney is now fighting to keep his law license in the state of California. The state bar charges John Eastman with making false and misleading claims in order to, quote, usurp the will of the American people and overturn election results for the highest office in the land. Eastman, who is testifying in his own defense, disputes the allegations. The former law professor argued that then Vice President Pence could overturn the results of the 2020 election. Eastman says last summer, Special Counsel Jack Smith seized his phone as a part of his investigation of former President Trump. And in December, Smith subpoenaed Eastman and local officials in several states over efforts to send fake electors to Washington. The portion of the I-95 highway that collapsed in Philadelphia on June 11th will reopen this weekend. A temporary fix will allow traffic on the heavily traveled roadway to resume. It collapsed after a tractor-trailer carrying gasoline flipped and caught fire. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro says crews have been working around the clock, including during the holiday weekend.
Based on the tremendous progress that we have made over the last 72 hours and the time it takes to complete the remaining steps, I can confidently state right here, right now, that traffic will be flowing here on I-95 this weekend. This weekend.
Crews will work on a permanent replacement bridge to replace the one that was destroyed. The meeting between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's President Xi lasted less than an hour. We'll take a look at what the face-to-face accomplished and what both countries expect to gain. And later, a warning about lithium batteries after a tragedy in New York City. We'll explain what happened. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Chinese officials are calling a recent diplomatic trip by Secretary of State Antony Blinken a new beginning for the two countries' strained relationship. Blinken's meeting with President Xi Jinping Monday ended with the pair agreeing to work towards stabilizing U.S.-China ties. However, Xi would not commit to resuming communication between the nations' militaries, something the U.S. sees as necessary in order to avoid conflict over a misunderstanding. Despite some disagreements, both sides are painting the meeting as a sign of progress. But as U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns tells Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan, there are still many unresolved issues, including the treatment of American companies.
The Chinese take these actions, they raid an American firm, they fine them, they jail the employees. It's happened to 4 or 5 of our firms over the last couple of months, and there's often no reason, no explanation given to the American company. It seems to be intimidation.
And Arn Westad joins me now. He's a professor of history and global affairs at Yale University. Arn, what does China want out of what they're calling a new relationship with the U.S.?
I think they first and foremost want to have some kind of stability in the relationship overall. It doesn't mean that they will change their policies on anything that is really important to them, such as Taiwan, or such as some of the military buildup that China has been undertaking. But it's very clear now that they want to go for more stability than what we've seen over the past few months and years.
And what does that look like, stability? Will they, well, I'll stop there. What does that look like, stability, in terms of as they see it?
I think from a Chinese point of view, there are several layers to this, as there always is in Chinese foreign policy. One is to avoid a conflict over Taiwan. And I think that's the key issue in what has developed now over the past 3-4 years in U.S.-China relations. Both sides know full well that there is only one solution to the Taiwan question, and that is status quo. And the Chinese are now moving a bit closer to actually expressing that. But above that, of course, there are other directions as well China thinks that one ought to go in, such as more trust-building measures and trying to deal with some of the global issues. But I think for them, that comes later. It's now about stability with regard to the Taiwan issue.
And Arn, what does the U.S. want out of the new state of things coming out of this meeting?
So as Ambassador Burns said, I mean, I think the main issue now from an American perspective is to try to reduce the quite relentless pressure that China has put on many American interests, both bilateral interests, but also interests with regard to the United States' presence overall in East Asia. The U.S. side wants to see less intimidation from the Chinese side, less attempts at dominating the region from the Chinese side. And I think, again, much of the test of this will be in the Taiwan Straits. It will be about what kind of rhetoric, not just from the Chinese side, but also from the American side, we will see after this meeting. That's the one to look for in order to try to grasp whether this has moved in a more positive direction after Blinken's visit.
You wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs about how opaque our understanding is of China. And so what don't we know and why don't we know it?
I think the most important thing that we don't know is the buildup of decision-making with regard to China's foreign policy, which is complicated. I mean, it's not straightforward in Washington either, as you know. But in China, it's even more complicated, mainly now because the role of the Chinese Communist Party has become so much more visible, so much more powerful in terms of deciding where Chinese foreign policy is going to go. And you saw that during Secretary Blinken's visit. It's the party leaders that have the top positions, that make the top decisions with regard to China's foreign policy, not the foreign minister, not the Minister of Defense. It is those that have the key positions within the party that are driving it. And it's important, I think, both in terms of policymaking on the US side, but also for the general public to understand that this is a nation that is now much more run by one party than it's been for more than a generation.
Well, thank you for leading perfectly into my last question, which is you bring up the example of Russia in your piece and basically make the case that the misunderstanding the U.S. had of the Soviet Union led to some bad policy choices as policymakers misinterpreted what was going on. So how should policymakers and the American public think about China given the complexity with understanding exactly how it works in there?
The most important thing by far, as United States foreign policy towards the Soviet Union showed when it was at its best, is to look at the output, look at what comes out. There is much we can't know about decision-making and probably will never know. But we have to look at what the output is. We have to look at what kind of rhetoric that the Chinese are using. We have to look at military preparedness on the Chinese side. We have to be very realistic, I think, in terms of the approach, which served us well when we were dealing with the Soviet Union, and I think would serve well with regard to China too. I mean, I'm not arguing, and I've never argued, that this is a kind of Cold War situation, but that's not the same thing that we can't learn from the Cold War in terms of how we make our decisions. It's about what they do. It's about the direction that Chinese policy seems to take. That's the key to this, much more than trying to understand the inner workings of the system. The more we know about that, the better it is. But we can never understand it perfectly.
Arne Westad with Yale University. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on.
The popular news aggregation site Reddit is reportedly facing pressure from hackers. According to The Verge, the ransomware group Black Cat wants Reddit to scrap its controversial new pricing policy and pay a $4.5 million ransom. If the company doesn't agree, the hackers say they will release 80 gigabytes of confidential data they claim to have stolen from Reddit back in February. The site has previously said that no user data was compromised. On this day in 1979, Jimmy Carter unveiled solar panels on the White House roof. Carter was struggling with a gas shortage caused by an Arab oil embargo. But the president hoped America would see the benefit of the new technology as a way to wean the country off of foreign dependence on oil.
A generation from now, this solar heater can either be a curiosity, a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or it can be just a small part of one of the greatest ventures ever undertaken by the American people.
Panels only lasted 7 years on the White House before the Reagan administration took them off. Archivists rescued some of them from a government warehouse, and in 2010, one of the panels was anonymously donated to a science museum in China, a country that dominates the solar power market today. China produced more than 80% of the solar panels now found on about 4% of American homes. Rescuers may be running out of time to save the 5 people missing since Sunday in that submersible in the North Atlantic. We'll look at the task they are facing and what it will take to succeed. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Here's a look at our top stories. Hunter Biden has agreed to plead guilty to several charges stemming from a 5-year federal investigation. The plea deal includes 2 charges for failure to pay income taxes in 2017 and 2018. He will also admit to the illegal possession of a handgun. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro says traffic will flow this weekend on I-95 less than 2 weeks after an overpass of the highway collapsed. The original timeline for reopening was 2 weeks. The cost of the repairs could reach $30 million. The U.S. Navy is sending a deep ocean salvage system to help in the search for a missing submersible with 5 people inside. The sub went to see the wreckage of the Titanic, but then lost contact. For more on this, I am joined by G. Michael Harris. He is a Titanic expedition leader and founder of RMS Titanic, Inc. So, Michael, first of all, what can you tell us about the people you know that are trapped in this submersible?
Well, one of the gentlemen that's in the submersible, a gentleman by the name of P.H. Nargelet, worked with him over the last 30 years. He was one of our dive masters at RMS, and he's just an all-around good guy.
And you've led multiple expeditions around the world, including treks to the Titanic wreckage. What can you tell us about the degree of difficulty, the dangers of these kinds of expeditions?
I mean, when you're out in the North Atlantic, it is, we only have a 3-month weather window, which pretty much goes from, the end of June to September, where the seas are calm enough to actually be out there and able to dive, which right now it's really early in the season. So I'm not sure, why OceanGate went out this soon. But, deploying subs in the water and spending all day, on the wreck and coming back, you're 6,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. You're 12,850 feet down. And so every precaution has to be taken at all times so that something doesn't go wrong, or at least mitigate everything you possibly can to ensure that nothing goes wrong.
And Michael, give us one example of the belt and suspenders approach, or the typical safety protocols that would be required for this kind of a trip.
Well, it's when we're diving in the Mirs, the Russian subs, or the Nautil, the French submersible, or just like the American Alvin, there is a transponder system that's set up. It's a net that we navigate in so that we know where we are at all times on the wreck of Titanic. We're in constant communication with the vessel up top, and it just makes it for a much safer environment. I understand this vessel, gets put on a sled and dumped in the water, and their only navigation is, from the support ship up top. And I don't adhere to that myself personally, and of course that's just a personal opinion, but I don't think that's the way it should be done.
So the deepest underwater rescue ever accomplished, I think, was 1,500 feet. This wreckage is at 12,000 feet, which is, for context, about 10 Empire State Buildings.
Yeah.
That seems challenging enough, but I mean, when you think of the search, give us your sense of how challenging you think it is, and what do you think's happened?
Well, I mean, we've been salvaging artifacts from the Titanic for the last 25 years plus. And if you're set up for the mission, I mean, we'll usually spend a year and a half planning a salvage operation to recover artifacts, to recover different pieces from the Titanic. And this is not something that you can throw together in, 48 hours. Plus, you have to mobilize equipment. You have to get equipment out there. And I'm not sure there's anything close enough that can actually get down to Titanic's depth to do any good if that is actually where the submersible is.
And as a final question, Michael, you've done it. You've been with other people who pay a pretty penny to go. Why do people go?
Well, I'm always the guy paying for everyone else to go. But they pay because it's a fascination to actually see the history in front of you, something you heard about, something that had been, gone for 70 years. So it's amazing to see it. It's amazing to be down there, and you get a sense of the passengers and everyone that was on board. It's an amazing feeling. And, it just happens to cost a lot of money because it's very expensive to deploy these subs, to deploy the ships, because you are 486 miles southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland. You're 1,000 miles straight out from Boston. And, the support vessel has to, feed you and house you and take care of you and get you out there and get you down to the wreck and get you back and take you back. So it's a very expensive venture, which is why, for us, it was a business. It wasn't a tourist thing.
Right.
And an experimental submersible, I'm not sure it should be.
Yeah, it's a chance to see a moment of history frozen in time. Titanic expedition leader G. Michael Harris, thank you so much for explaining all of that to us.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
More than 1 million people have lost Medicaid coverage since April, when COVID pandemic protections ended, and millions more may still be at risk of losing it. According to KFF, recipients across 22 states have been disenrolled from the program. More than 1.3 million people have lost coverage, with Florida seeing the largest number of people dropped. I spoke with Daniel Sy, a deputy administrator and director at the Center for Medicaid and CHIP Services, back in April about what people who have relied on Medicaid should do during this re-enrollment period.
Many folks that will be over income for eligible will be eligible for highly subsidized coverage outside of Medicaid. We want to help get people there. For folks that remain eligible for Medicaid, we want to make sure folks update contact information, look out for a piece of paper in the mail, and successfully complete that renewal process.
Those working to maintain enrollment say that most people have lost coverage for procedural reasons, which means in some cases simply not opening the mail with re-enrollment forms. Figures vary by state because not all states are taking advantage of all measures available to reach eligible recipients. Only 29% were disenrolled after being found ineligible. A federal judge in Arkansas has struck down the state's ban on gender-affirming care for minors. It would have prohibited doctors from providing hormone treatments or gender-affirming surgery to anyone under 18. The judge called the law unconstitutional. Arkansas was the first state to introduce such a measure back in 2021. Since then, 18 other states have passed similar bills targeting LGBTQ+ youths. There is a new warning about lithium-ion batteries after a fire left 4 people dead in New York City. Elaine Quijano shows us where the fire started.
The deadly fire broke out just after midnight at this e-bike repair shop in Lower Manhattan. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but that's all it took for the smoke and flames to kill 4 people living above the shop. Just hours later, the fire commissioner left no doubt about what sparked it.
It is very clear that this was caused by lithium-ion batteries and e-bikes. There was a very large number of both batteries and e-bikes. This location is known to the fire department. We have written violations at this location before, and we have conducted enforcement in this location before.
Officials say so far this year, 108 fires in New York City and 13 deaths have been linked to lithium-ion battery explosions. Back in April, 2 children were killed after an e-bike exploded. Experts warn the resulting fires from lithium-ion batteries behave differently. They ignite quickly, burn hotter, and can be difficult for firefighters to extinguish. Ed Benjamin founded the Light Electric Vehicle Association. He says people should follow strict protocols with e-bike batteries.
As we say, never charge when there's not someone present. Never charge at night. Never charge overnight.
Always put a timer on it so it'll turn itself automatically, even if you forget.
Last year, there were 220 fires related to e-bikes in New York City. Back in March, the city of New York announced a plan to combat lithium-ion battery fires by placing e-bike charger stations outdoors. John?
Elaine Quijano in New York City. Thank you. Coming up, a new report warns of dire consequences as climate change melts glaciers and ice on the legendary Himalayan mountain range. We'll take a closer look. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. The world's tallest mountains are losing ice, which could pose a serious danger to humanity. That's according to a new report from the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. The agency, which oversees the Hindu Kush Himalayas, says changes to the glaciers, snow, and permafrost are unprecedented and largely irreversible. The report also warns 2 billion people are at risk. To discuss the report, I am joined by Isabella Kogel, the Deputy Director General of the agency that authored the report. Isabella, the 2 billion people either live in the region or are downstream from the mountains. What will these melting glaciers mean in the next few decades?
Thank you. So, yes, the crisis is getting worse, and it's getting worse fast. That's why this report is so important. It needs to trigger rapid and urgent action, even if this feels remote to us sitting far away from this region. It is going to affect us all, whether that's through the mass movement of peoples or through sea level rise. I live and work in Nepal. I've traveled to India, to Bhutan, and to Bangladesh. And I've seen how farmers are subject to changing weather patterns and subject to complete crop failure because of increasing pests and diseases. We have whole herds of yak, which are mountain oxen, that are wiped out overnight through an unexpected snowfall. We have massive floods happening every year that wipe out homes, that wipe out whole communities, that wipe out farmlands. We've got new diseases coming up to these mountains, such as dengue, which are, again, killing children, killing the elderly. There's a whole cornucopia of complex, extreme risks that are facing us in these mountains today.
And let me go back to something you said before, which was the risk internationally that goes beyond just the geographical region in which this mountain range exists. Help us understand that a little bit better.
So the Himalayas are the third largest ice mass on Earth. When the glaciers in the Himalayas melt, the ice sheets in Greenland, Arctic, and Antarctica are also melting. This means that there will be sea level rise. There'll be quite dramatic changes in ocean circulation as a result of increased freshwater into the oceans. And this will have huge impacts on us all. Equally, the people who are losing their livelihoods, of which there are 2 billion, that's a quarter of the world's population, where will they go? Where will they go? They will have to go and find safer places to live in. And we will have to offer those safer places to live in.
And Isabella, the report, though, says that this is largely irreversible. Explain what that means.
So once the warming triggers the melting, it is impossible to stop it. So the change that we are causing now will not stop, even if we keep emissions at our current levels. This warming has already triggered the permafrost, which is the frozen ground around the glaciers, is already thawing. Once it starts thawing, there is a tipping point, and it keeps thawing. Once it thaws, it also emits carbon dioxide and methane, which has the potential to wipe out any gains that we make from reducing carbon dioxide.
So is all hope lost, or can anything be done to either arrest this or mitigate it or do something?
So all hope is not lost. If we commit seriously to decarbonization now, we still have an open window. But let's keep that window open. We need to seriously commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And whatever investment we make now will be a benefit for the future. We're better to invest in decarbonization now than we are to protect and prevent the disasters in the future. We have a lot of climate finance coming in from various countries, but that finance is flowing too slowly. We need to speed up the flow of the finance to help people on the ground. We do a lot in terms of early warning, in terms of bringing in more climate resilient crops, but we need to really scale this up. The technologies are there. We just need to get the money flowing to the right people, right places. And of course,
sorry, before we run out of time, many people will know this region because it encompasses Mount Everest, and they know that because of climbing. What would the effect be on climbing?
Well, already we know that at least 100 meters of glacier has reduced on Mount Everest over the last 60 years. That's almost since the first successful ascent of Everest. But there are other effects such as melting of the permafrost, which will cause increased rockfall, increased avalanches. We've had, I think, about 16 deaths on Everest already. They are not all caused by climate change, but some of them were caused by rockfall and avalanche. So it's very likely we're going to have much more increased risks to mountaineers and climbers and the Sherpas that go with them as we move forwards into the future.
Isabella Kogel, Deputy Director General at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
NASA just learned something new about the planet of Jupiter. We'll show you the striking discovery when we return. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. A new image from NASA shows lightning on Jupiter. The agency released this shot of a green dot on the planet's north pole last week. NASA says the Juno spacecraft captured the image during its 31st flyby of Jupiter on December 30th, 2020. This discovery comes 4 months after astronomers discovered 12 new moons orbiting Jupiter, bringing its moon count up to 92. Many moons. Up next, it's 60 Minutes. For all of us here at CBS News Primetime, that's our report. I'm John Dickerson. Thank you for spending the hour with us.